Hi, I'm Selena from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Tamora Pierce, or Tammy as she prefers to be called. And she is a writer of many young adult books, fantasy. And I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about what she writes.
Oh,
Tammy?
um, when I started out as a girl in the 50s and 60s, just when the more modern idea of feminism was getting stronger, but not very, um, my parents weren't particularly interested in giving me the traditional view of what a girl's life was. And my dad, in particular, well, poor man had three daughters. So basically, I was the oldest son. And what my dad read, I read, which meant I cut my eye teeth on Edgar Rice Burroughs and Ian Fleming's James Bond books, in addition to the family world book encyclopedia, my mother's art textbooks from college with the interesting pictures. And my dad tried to teach me to box. Well, I did try my hand at archery. He took me fishing and stuff. So basically, I was the oldest boy. My next sister did a lot better on the whole hunting and fishing thing. But he shared his love of what was then called men's adventure novels. And they never censored what I read if I could reach it. And if I sat on the couch with it in my lap and didn't run around with it, I could read it. And they figured if I had questions, I'd ask. Or if I couldn't understand it, I'd put it away. And so I was reading all these adventure books. And by the time I got into higher level grade school, I was finding some female characters who weren't like Flossie and Freddie, um, and Nan and Bert, and the girls wore skirts and socks and little shoes, and the boys ran around and did stuff. I found Mara, Daughter of the Nile by Eloise McGraw, and The Witch of Blackbird Pond. And they were great, but I was hitting my pirate phase at that point, and I found a little teeny tiny bit about Mary Read and Anne Bonny that just trashed them to the dogs and back. Never talked about their piracy. Gave the impression they just hung around and looked decorative, not that they were two of the most feared and respected pirate captains in the Mediterranean. This was the 60s. Girls didn't do that. So when my dad caught me telling stories to myself as I did dishes, rather than say, Tammy, people will think you're nuts if you talk to yourself, he said that I should try to write a book. He neglected to mention it was difficult, for which I thanked him many years later. Um, but if he was suggesting it, I figured, well, it was righteous, right? So I asked him what I should write about. And of course, we traded books all the time. He bet me $1 that that I couldn't read the Three Musketeers in a week. And 4 days later, I came and said, where's my dollar? uh, and he thought about it. He knew what I liked. We watched the same TV shows, Star Trek, um, combat shows like that. And he said, you could you could go back in time. And little geek that I was, I thought I could pretend I went back in time to the Trojan War. And he said the thing that made it stick, he said I could use his typewriter. If I had touched that typewriter before that moment, I would be missing a hand. He did the union newsletter on the typewriter. It was death. I figured if he thought enough of this writing thing that I was allowed to use the typewriter, I should give it a go. And I sat down and started typing. And my parents were breaking up, so he moved out with a typewriter, but I just kept going. And the next year, my homeroom teacher caught me saying, I don't have anything for me to read over the weekend. She knew me very well by then. And she handed me this book called The Fellowship of the Ring by some guy named Tolkien. And I finished it at 2 o'clock the next morning and cried because I thought there wasn't any more. And that was how I got started reading and writing fantasy, and how I got started writing adventure fiction by my dad.
Wow,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is incredible. So, what can readers expect from your newest book?
From the newest, well, that's going a couple years back. I tend to write, I have written in two universes. One that I call the Tortall universe began with my first quartet about a girl who agrees with her twin to switch places. He goes to the university to study magic. She goes to the palace to take up what he would have done, become a squire, page, a squire, and a knight. And I wasn't doing anything that winter after I got out of college. And I just finished my first book length manuscript and promptly buried it in a crossroads at the dark of midnight under layers of dirt, rock, and cement. So it will never be seen. But 6 months later, I sat down to write what I wanted to read, which was when I was writing, that's what I did. And what I wanted to read when I first started out reading fantasy, I wanted to read a girl knight. I wanted to read girl heroes. This is, again, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They were few on the ground, even in the beginning of the 70s. And I had a fragment of a dream that got it going. And let's see, I started in November, finished in March with an 800-page manuscript. I called The Song of the Lioness, about a girl who disguises herself as a boy. And I started shopping it around. I went to work in a group home for girls, and they weren't allowed to read my manuscript because there was sex and drugs and alcohol use and violence. And those things had gotten them into the home in the first place. But I had worked in juvenile court in Philadelphia. I had worked in mental wards, and I was very familiar with teenagers. And so the girls physically made me stop at the dining table every day when they came rushing home after school on my shift. And every night before bedtime say, Pierce, Pierce, tell us more, Alana. And I would have this manuscript in my page and I'd read it aloud, edited, but not as edited as the director of the home would have liked. Because these girls had done things as bad, if not worse, and criminally, or at least they lived very abused lives. I wasn't going to sugarcoat it for them. So with judicious editing, I ended up telling them that story every day I was on shift, 1 week on, 1 week off, until I finished it. And then I started a longer story about them in a science fiction setting, rocketing around the universe, getting into trouble, and meeting hot guys, which they loved. But I was sending that manuscript around. And after I left the home, I moved to Manhattan. And I had tried several editors with no luck. And I'd gone to work for a literary agency as the office clerk. And when the guy who supervised me heard me talking about this book was trying to market and having no luck with, he told me that I should ask Claire Smith, who at the time was Dean Koontz's and Judy Blume's agent. So I went and I said, Claire, I have this fantasy. And she said, put it on my desk. And she only read half of it. She gave it back to me and she said, you need to break this into 4 books for teenagers, because it was an adult manuscript. And at first I sulked for a day or two, I think, but then I thought, wait a minute. I've already told the story to teenagers. Of course, I had to rewrite it and rewrite the rewrite. But first 2 editors to see that first quarter turned it down. One went right over his head. I don't know what he was thinking. I forget the other guy. And Claire said Jean Carl at Athenaeum. Happily for me, I did not know that Jean Carl was the doyenne of YA fantasy and science fiction at that time, or I never would have found the courage. And I didn't see why I should, because she had already turned it down, but she'd taken 5 pages to say so. So Claire saw something I didn't. And I met with Jean and we talked, and I explained about how there were 3 more books to follow and about the girls and everything. And at the end of our meeting, and a science fiction project I was hoping to do, because she loved science fiction too. And as I got up to go and we shook hands, she says, well, if you make the changes we discussed, I'll take the series. Wow. And I thanked her very politely. And I went outside and I thanked her assistant very politely. And it wasn't until I was punching the elevator button that I realized I had just sold my first book. Of course, I had to rewrite it. 2 more rewrites. I think they all went through 2 to 3 rewrites. And then I never did get to the science fiction project I told her about. And I can't even remember now what it was, because by then it had been 76 was when I started the original manuscript. And now we were up to the mid 80s. And I wanted to tackle something. If Alana was who I was as a teenager, I wanted somebody who was like me as an adult, a semi-reclusive person who got on better with animals than people. And that's where I got Dane. Also, my friend Raquel, who loves animals as much as I do, called me up and says, turn on the TV, turn on this channel, watch this guy. And Sir David Attenborough, breathless as ever, was walking up the side of a volcano. And I just went, what? And that was that. So with Sir David as a role model, I went on to the Dane books. And then by then, I was starting to build a fan base, and they wanted more about Alana. They wanted more about the Knights. And I thought it would be interesting to try what would be the lot of a girl who goes for her knighthood after Alana, after everyone knows she's a girl. Because she's going to run into a whole different set of problems from the girl who passed as a boy until she was 18. And so I thought, well, let me give her some advantages. So she's a big girl, but I based her on a fan friend of mine, splendid creature who did whitewater rafting, mountain climbing, long-term hiking. And all she heard from her family and friends was, you're so pretty, you have such a nice face. If you lost weight, you'd get a boyfriend. I saw somebody beautiful. So that was Kel. And by then I was also starting to look beyond the Tortall universe. And a couple of publishers had asked me if I was doing something else, which is how I ended up with Scholastic doing the Circle of Magic books. Something like the world I was living in then, New York City, with all its peoples and languages and foods and things going on. And kids now whose power, like Alana's, is innate, but it takes it different routes. And they are all, in one respect or another, damaged kids. Discarded. Briar loses his mother when he's 4 and lives on the street. Sandry's parents die in a plague. Daju's family's ship goes down and she's the sole survivor, mostly because she was on a board and saw this thing of food and wanted it so badly that she didn't realize her nascent metal magic woke up and called the crate to her. And then Triss, whose family just found her too weird and too creepy, and things happened around Triss, like earthquakes and the odd storm and the occasional flood, and they kept passing her on until finally they sent her to temple school.
Wow. So what do you think draws people to these kinds of books?
Well, for those of us who came of age in the 60s and 70s, we were women and, bless their hearts, a bunch of men were looking for something that wasn't the same old John Wayne formula. All respect to the greats of the past. I cut my eye teeth on them. I needed them to help me find my own vision and to keep me entertained when I'm not working on my own stuff. People think, oh, you must have such a great time, entertaining yourself with all this writing. And it's like, you don't write, do you? That's it. I can tell. But when I got to college, I went to an Ivy League school, the gods save us. The feminist revolution of the 60s and 70s was booming, and I was part of it. My mother was very much a feminist. She raised me and my sisters to think feminist, and I got all kinds of grief for it in high school. And even in college, the Women's Center didn't like me because I had a sense of humor and I was living with a guy. But it was a time for women to start really grabbing hold. And some of my favorite writers, female writers, Barbara Hambly, Robin McKinley, oh, the Deed of Paxenarian. It's right behind me. No, I listened. Okay. I'll remember it probably when I ring off. These writers were beginning to publish in the mid 80s. They had come up like I did. Hambly began, Elizabeth Moon. That's Deed of Paxenarian. Robin McKinley. Did I say Robin? Of course, Anne McCaffrey preceded us, and Marion Zimmer Bradley. But we were the generation, because the 70s spawned the feminist science fiction and fantasy writers who mainly were centered on gay rights, gay people and gay rights. And while we were all reading that, a bunch of us were gonna, I'm sorry, I'm straight. It's a problem. But we began publishing at the end of the 70s, the turn of the 80s. And we were doing female heroes. A lot of us, like Elizabeth Moon, Barbara Hambly, were And even, well, Robin did a couple of them as well. Women who weren't ashamed of being women, who nonetheless knew how to enter combat if they had to. And then there was the magic aspect of it as well.
Mhm.
So I just trundled along really until the mid 90s when Michael found me. I was friends with the guys at Books of Wonder, and they mentioned SIFWA to me, Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America. Of course, you know.
Mhm.
But it was Michael who I had recommended one of his short stories. I thought I'd get into the community by reading and recommending things that I really liked for the Nebula, which is how Michael found out about me. And he was in New York and got a hold of me and said, "Hey, I really want to thank you. You want to meet up for dinner?" And he was so appalled when he heard I had never been to a science fiction and fantasy convention. I had done bookstore appearances by then, and I was starting to do school visits by the late 80s. And I once I got the knack of that, I really love doing school visits because I torture them first. Um, but that was when I got to be part of the community at the time, started going to conventions. At Boscone that first time, this woman came up to me and she says, "Hi, I'm Christina." And I'd seen her at my panels and she was really enthusiastic. And I said, "Hi." She says, "Do you ever get to Pittsburgh?" I grew up a little ways south of Pittsburgh, actually, in Connellsville. And she said, "Then you have to come to our con." And that was how I got doing my second con in Pittsburgh. I missed that one too. And then as a part of that, one of the women, Diane Turncheck, I don't know if you've ever met, she organized a workshop for teen writers of speculative fiction. And up until the last 2 years, I was at every one. I would come early for that and then go on to the convention with my husband and hang out with my friends. And then I started going to more and more. And as people, I've had people, especially early on, come up to me and say, "You're Tamora Pierce?" They look at my back. And when I was at Boscone the first time, I was looking at the table that was all little animal statues and everything. And I heard someone say, "Look who's here. Do you see that? You see it?" Because I hadn't been public like that.
So there are a lot of groups and organizations that you'd recommend to other writers that have helped you in your career?
Oh, yeah. Well, not just help you in your career, although one of the things I look forward to is the panel discussions, and for the topics I'm into, I will go and sit in the back and try to look, ordinary and not like author. I hide my badge and everything. And once I started getting out to conventions, and once the word started going around on the networks, then more and more schools came forward and more book conventions started coming forward. And then I reached the Mecca. And I thought I'd always wanted it. I got my first book tour. I think that was that Kel? Yeah, I think it was Kel. Was my first book tour. And up until the last couple years, I was doing book tours for every book that came out. And then schools, when I was on tour, a lot of times they'll set you up with a local school if you're interested in talking to teenagers, and I always am.
Oh, speaking of your book tours and new books, with
Yes.
your newest book was Tempests and Slaughter. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yes.
Did you do any research in writing that book
I
at all? Or
I research everything.
okay.
Uh, I'm not, I keep telling people, I mentioned it before, I'm not good at making stuff up. So when I start turning in ideas over in my head, it's multi-year process for one thing, because I have to wait for something to jump up and grab me. Um, I do listen to when fans put in votes for what they'd like to see. Um, Tempests and Slaughter, everyone had met Aram with the Kell books. Hang on a second.
Yeah.
No, I don't. Nope. There went my rocks.
Oh, great.
It's been out for a couple years now. Uh, it's part of the Lioness universe, one of the Lioness universe. Um, Kell in the Kell books, the Protector of the Small, uh, teams up with a very powerful young mage. Um, his original name was Aram Salmalim. He's known in those books as Numer because he got his education in southern Carthage and had to leave there quickly when he incurred the emperor's hate. And Numer, I based him on Jeff Goldblum. See, there are side benefits to all that. You get to put your favorite faces and mannerisms and everything in, so you don't have to make stuff up. And Aram Numer was, well, he's very absent-minded. He's very powerful. He once turned a bad guy into a tree. And Dane, my female hero, asks, well, what kind is it? And he says, I don't know. She says, I think it's fair bad of you to turn someone into a tree and not know what it is. And that readers love stuff like that, both the interplay, because she's more practical than he is, and he's more absent-minded than she is. And the fans kept saying, we'd love to know about the time he was at the university in Carthage. So I started pulling together all my materials. I expanded my map so that I could include that part of Carthage that has the university, because the university is mentioned, I think, in all of the series that I've set in the Tortal universe. And so I take him back to the university. He begins when he is 7 years old, because he comes from the other side of the inland ocean, and from a very small city state, where he goes through their best magic mages before he's 7. And they say, we can't teach him anymore. He's too strong. You have to send him to Carthage. So he's been at the university in Carthage ever since. And Tempests and Slaughter, he is finding his way at the university. He's their youngest pupil. Luckily, he encounters the 2 next oldest pupils who the fans knew already, Maurice Kingsford and Ozorn, the prince, who show up. I based Ozorn on Ozzy Osbourne.
Okay.
I love Ozzy.
So what was the biggest challenge that you
I've
had?
lost your sound.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Something?
Can you hear me now?
Hang on. Let me call Julie.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Is it on your side?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
I can just hear you, but very barely. Hold on, let me get Julie.
Oh, okay.
Just lost sound. Jules shows up in the other universe I have, the Circle of Magic.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Wait, are you in the circle? Or is Aniki in the? No.
I'm in the.
Can you hear me?
The Becca Cooper books.
Try now?
Hello?
Ah, I must have, let me show. I
Hello?
must have him.
Now you're really quiet again. How about now?
Can
Hello?
you-
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep,
Okay.
Oh, okay.
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 So I ended up at Carthack with, oh, did I tell you who Ozorn is based on?
No.
One of my favorite ever rock and rollers, Ozzy Osbourne.
Okay.
And Varese is a woman based on a woman I used to work for who was just brilliant at organizing humongous events for overfed, overbred, overpaid bankers.
Wow.
So I figured, here he is. He's seven when he starts. He meets Ozorn and Varese, and they become like this for the whole first book. As they grow older, and they're all three the youngest people at that part of the school, and they're all very gifted in their way. So it's partly their struggles with that, dealing with accidents, dealing with health, dealing with magic, dealing with interfering gods. Poor Aram has attracted the attention of the Carthaki national goddess, the graveyard hag. And she just thinks he's splendid. And also, Ozorn was pretty good to her too. So she smiled on him for a while. She's this cranky old lady who chews with her mouth open. She has terrible teeth. Her hair varies from shaved slave head to crackles. And she's a trickster. I love trickster gods.
Okay. So what else can we expect from you in the future?
Well, right now I gotta get Aram's story told. Right now that puts him in 3 years after the end of the first book, when he is approaching graduation at the university and is about to move on to graduate work. He is frighteningly powerful, young as he is. When he makes a mistake, it's a big one. And he just had this, because my fans are wonderful. I love my fans. And a while back, about 7 or 8 years, they said, Tammy, Aram lost. Aram doesn't have any healing magic. And this was when I was well into Tempests and Slaughter. And I said, he lost his healing? Because I have him in healing classes with the formidable teacher and everything. Yep. So I thought, great. I have to use the second book. And this put me to a screaming halt for months. A reason and a mechanism for him losing what is so much a part of the first book. So I came up with it, and I'm rather pleased with myself, if I do say so myself, because he runs afoul of a god. And not just any old god either, but based on somebody I really, really, really wanted to portray in a rotten way, and I succeeded.
Excellent.
And given the warning to look for this fishy thing, I think most readers will figure out fairly quickly who I based him on.
Okay,
Not with
great.
the figure.
All right. Now I have some questions for you on being a writer.
Yeah.
What is your favorite part of being a writer on the whole writing and publishing process?
Finishing.
I would say that's a great part.
I like casting characters. I have books and books and books of magazines and books on different countries, different periods of time, different skills, different homes, different styles of education. I have 2 big shelves full of cookbooks, and I don't cook. So it's all reference. And I love that aspect of pulling together what I know of history, of nations, of languages. I base the words in my books on words from actual languages that I pulled out that I fiddle with a bit. Names. You don't want to jump your reader out of their suspension of disbelief. My theory is that when you're reading fantasy and science fiction, speculative fiction of any kind, you need to hang on to as much of your suspension of disbelief as you can. So I try to make the magic as realistic as based on real world things, chemicals, religions, things like that. So that when the reader is reading along and they hit that first magic bit, all of their suspension of disbelief is right there. They haven't wasted it on me making everything else as realistic, as well based in the real world as possible, so that they have that suspension to get them through the magic part. And even the magic I base on medieval pastimes, foreign forms of magic and magical belief and practice.
Mhm.
The critic Lionel Trilling, and I always say this, said it best: the immature artist imitates, the mature artist steals. Sturgeon added his addendum, which was first file off the serial numbers.
I love that. So what do you consider the most challenging part of the writing process, and how do you overcome that?
This is the one that got people deciding I was weird when I took writing fiction in college. I said plot. And they're like, no, character development, inner struggle. And I'm there, no, I can do that. But coming up with the plot, that's the hard part for me, which is why I do, among other resources, I base a lot of what I do on ideas I've gotten from history or from human beings or from situations in the current world. It gives me a launch pad, and I badly need it. Once I get rolling, I'm fine. I may have to go onto Facebook to my fan sites or to Julie downstairs or my friend Bruce Coble, who's Kipriot the Trickster God, an award-winning YA middle grade young reader writer himself. I go over and say, help, help. I need, where are you stuck now, Tammy?
So what has been your favorite adventure during your writing career?
Well, oh, of course, silly me. I was just remembering the other day. I mean, I went to Hong Kong. Did I go? No, I went to the island off the shore of China, the one that China wants back.
Oh, Hong Kong.
No, not Hong Kong, where the other Chinese government is. Now I hate it when I go blank like that. Taiwan.
Oh, Taiwan.
I went to Taiwan. I've been to Canada, of course, and Alaska, and I've been to England a couple of times. My favorite thing, the first time I went because I could afford to, and I was going to be going there on tour the next year, and I wanted to go around and make the tourist mistakes before people were watching me. So I went to visit my English publisher, and they actually sent me to a school there and had me do an appearance. The kids were lovely. And then when I went on tour, they knew that part of my ancestry is Scots, that I have dreamed dreams of Edinburgh Castle all my adult life. They couldn't. They just had me do 2 stops and then put me on the train back to London to catch my plane. But my handler made it possible for me to go up to the front of Edinburgh Castle. And that would have been enough. But she said, which do you want to do? Do you want to fly in or do you want to take the train? And I had been to Manchester and London. And I said, I've been Northern England. I'd really like to take the train. They got a lot of rabbits in England. But we got there and we're pulling into Edinburgh, and I'm hanging out the window that doesn't open, staring because we're coming in this lush green garden. And I realized there's a cliff right in back of it. And the only cliff I know of in Edinburgh is the one that's underneath Edinburgh Castle. So I'm hanging out through the back window of the taxi, and it's going up and up and up. And I burst into tears in the taxi. And my handler's going, Tammy, what's wrong? And I said, I've just saw the rock, Edinburgh Castle, and I rode my way here. It was glorious, this huge mess. So I want to go back. But I loved London. Everybody was very kind, especially, they knew I was American, so I was a little anyway. And I went to Denmark for a science fiction convention, actually. And our guide from my publisher took us around to the sites in the capital, and then he also took us out to the North Sea. We could only stay out 30 minutes because it was March and freezing, but it's not something you forget. That powerful and far north.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So what is the greatest lesson you've learned thus far in your writing career?
Being too stupid to know when to quit really helps. Because if you're that, then you keep going, and there will always be people who will tell you what they think you should be doing, what they think you should be reading, what they think you should be writing, how they think you should live your life. There will always be a lot of people doing that. And most of them, when you say what you want to do or you do what you want to do, will either impugn your sanity or they'll say you're stupid. And I just learned very early on as an adult, being too stupid to know when to quit is a real asset, because you don't know that they're right. You just know you got to do what you need to do, and you keep doing it. And at first, you're going to be your own worst critic. And actually, you continue that to a greater or lesser extent for the rest of your career. So, and it doesn't actually matter what you do, whether you're a carpenter, a housewife, a doctor, a librarian, a store clerk, you're always going to have that.
Mm-hmm.
Being too stupid to know when to quit means that you run the risk of getting ahead far more than all of those people who did the smart thing they weren't really in love with.
Hmm, that's interesting advice. What piece of advice? It's kind of the same thing, but what piece of advice would you want to share with other writers?
Well, I think the working ones already know it, which is, apart from being too stupid to know when to quit, keep writing. Write as much as you can. Um, Write every day if you can. Fit it in. I used to write on subways, on seats in the park, on airplanes. Write when you can. Write as much as you can every day. Set yourself limits. And more often than not, when you start out, you are not going to like what you're doing. You're going to hate it. I don't care. And neither should you. You will, but you shouldn't. Just keep writing. The more you do, the better you get, the more grip you get on the language, the more grip you get on the sources of your ideas. Go back to your old obsessions, those books that you had to read every last one, or those movies that you had to see all by the same director. Visiting all the historical sites in the state. Whenever you get an obsession, follow through on it, because sooner or later you can take that material and you get stuck for an idea, start riffling through those lists and lists and lists of obsession. One will pop up. I needed a native culture for the fourth Alana book, Lioness Rampant. I wanted one that was not Native American. I wanted one that was not European. And I was going nuts. And then I remembered during my obsession, I thought I had a book about me about the Vietnam War. And I read everything I could find, watched everything, talked to a lot of vets. And one of the things I learned in all my reading was that the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese agreed on one thing. They wanted to kill the native Montagnard tribes. And my favorite outfit of the war, Special Forces, had a number of camps in the Montagnard Highlands. They learned the languages, they learned the diet, they became part with the people, and the Montagnards helped them and kept them safe. And I was going through my list and I thought of Special Forces and the Montagnards and the Montagnard culture. And I realized that I had my Civil War for the fourth book. Not only that, but when I went to my maps, I have a lot of maps. I went to my maps of Southeast Asia and I started pulling people's first names and last names, and from places, not well-known places, but obscure places, rivers, peninsulas, valleys. And that's how I build up my backlog of names for a particular culture in a particular setting. I base it on a part of the world that's real. And then I break it up. I break up the names. I break up the place names. I may combine. And I end up having people names, place names, and names within the culture that sound like real names from a real place because they were. I just doctored them to make them my own.
Okay. Now I have some questions about you as a person. What is or are your passions when you're not writing, and how do you make time for things, for hobbies and things that you love?
Well, fortunately, I can only write for so long. In New York, when I started writing full time, I discovered I had to get out of our teeny tiny apartment. And when I was doing a day job down by the part of New York where they launched for the Statue of Liberty, there's a little park there. And I would go on my lunch hour from the law firm, and these elderly gentlemen, retirees, would be there feeding sparrows from their hands. And more than anything, I wanted that to happen for me. So I started going to Riverside Park near where I lived to take breaks, to get a walk, to get outside. And I break up dry unsalted peanuts and feed them to the sparrows. And then the squirrels started coming. So I had to get peanuts for the squirrels. And pretty soon I was a sight in Riverside Park, the crazy animal lady. And occasionally I would bring home an animal rescue, a couple of times cats, once a parakeet. She was living with a very rough gang of sparrows, and I managed to catch her. We named her Zorak. She was evil. So I was feeding critters in the park. I had regular times and everything. And I have to admit, I got a kick over in the later years. I would come in at the entry that went to my side street and walk down along a walkway down to the War Memorial. And the pigeons and sparrows and starlings would wait for me. They knew the days I came and the times I came, and they would follow me. They would fly along with me down the walk, and I just watched people coming toward me.
Wow.
And they're going, and I'm there, hi. I once rescued a chicken there. They had gotten away from somebody. And the poor thing, it was winter. And I had a heck of a time finding an expert who would help me find a home for her. And I took her over to Animal Medical in New York City, which was the size of a skyscraper. And she had a black toe, one foot was damaged, and she coughed. So it was Halloween too. It just gets better and better. I got in with a cat carrier into the cab with a chicken in it, and that poor man. They put patients at the Animal Medical in a room with sliding doors on either side so they can look in as they go by, see if you need help or if something's growing wrong. And they left them open with me and chicken. And I brought her out and I was petting her and, with my fingernails, and she was purring and I was saying chick, 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 chicken, which made her purr more. And they would be walking by and going, and one of them looked in and he looked at me and he said, that's a chicken, all right. And I went out to find out, we were there a couple hours, and I went out to find out what the hell was taking so long. It was Halloween. Did I mention it was Halloween?
Yes.
Yeah. The woman at the desk said, well, we're having to get the rare bird specialist. And I looked at her and my hillbilly came out, and I looked at her and I said, that is a plain old white barnyard hen. She is not exotic. Oh, exotic bird specialist. She says, well, that's an exotic bird in New York City. So I found her with the help of a bird rescue organization that does domestic birds. In Maryland, I was able to get chicken to a good home in Vermont.
That's a great story.
I was the crazy park lady.
Wow. I know you said you really enjoy animals, so that's...
Yeah, and they ended up, the number of the squirrels I knew personally, number of the birds, the pigeons I knew personally. I had one handsome fellow. His name was Gloucester. He had a bad shoulder, and he was black and had a lousy temper. And I named after him after Richard, Duke of York, Gloucester. And I would feed him. He would land on my shoulder. And in case I hadn't noticed this big black pigeon on my shoulder, he'd smack me with his wing. So I'd give him his peanuts, and he'd eat a handful of peanuts and smack me with his wing again, fly off. I miss him still.
So that kind of brings me to another question. When about your writing space and things like that. Normally, the writers often have furry or feathered or otherwise non-human companions who either help them or hinder them with their work. And do you have any of those now? And
Oh,
and
well,
if you do, does it help or hinder you?
she's not, she only sleeps here. Oh, I'm sorry, sweetie. I didn't mean to wake up.
I had a feeling you must.
Well, I rescued
Oh,
her, Autumn. This is Autumn. I rescued Autumn back some years ago, and I wanted to get her, their sister she was wandering around with, another tortoise shell. Autumn isn't much for cuddling, but she likes to be here. But I've never been able to catch Torty, I think, because she saw me take Autumn away and has never forgiven me. She'll let me feed her. She eats in the basement, and she has dishes, and she has warm places she can be. But I found Zorak in the park. And we'd always had cats when I could. I had cats. I love cats. So presently we have 7. We were up to 11 at one point. The nice thing about doing what I do is when I tell fans that I found kittens or something, because a lot of times cats would have kittens in the garage or in the basement. Fans are very happy to take your cats off your hands. This one poor man drove all the way across New York State on Thanksgiving with her daughter to pick up her official Tamora Pierce kitten.
oh wow.
Yeah, because I said, and so I'm lucky. What I found out when I moved here to Syracuse is that the 7 worst towns in the United States for abandoned pets, particularly cats, are college towns.
I can imagine.
Because, you got a dog you take out and walk around. People figure that, well, cats have wild animal mostly anyway, and they dump them. They're not equipped. So when we moved here, I started finding all these strays. And of course, I see animals, as my friends in New York City can tell you, I feed them. And so we had a steady flow of strays and ferals. And sometimes the ferals would present us with children. And when they were old enough, I'd post it on the internet, and the fans would say, me. So I have a Tamora Pierce cat.
Oh, that's great. So what does your writing space look like? And what is it that you need to have with you when you're writing?
Well, as you can see, there's a number of books. What is not so clear are my various stuffies all over the room, various figures of animals and mythical creatures, various pieces of rock that have gotten my attention or that are a kind of rock that I am particularly fond of, like, well, this is a fossil.
Oh, yes.
This
The
one's
trilobite?
from my desk. This was granted to me by a Native American man and his daughter, who petitioned the tribe to allow me to have this stone. So I take very good care of it. So I won't disgrace him. I am very fond of opals of all kinds, actually sparkly rocks of all kinds. And I have all these things here, my worry beads, one set. I have several. Different stones I like, different figurines that have been given to me by fans and by teachers and by booksellers. Just anything. I'm a magpie, I confess. Excuse me.
Are there any favorite foods or drinks that you have to have with you when you're writing?
Well, I always have to have my water, ice water, and I drink large amounts of it, always have. Uh, Now and then that I'm better off, I occasionally have soda too, but that's more for watching television. I was, I think I was first starting to do school and library convention appearances, and I was at a librarian convention when I was very early on in the game, and discovered that library conventions and bookseller conventions have events at breakfast. And I had been a lifelong loather of coffee. My husband drank it by the buckets. I couldn't abide it, couldn't live with it, couldn't see the point. But I was falling asleep at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I started drinking coffee then. And everyone loves to watch me drink it in public because I don't like it. I knock it back. Like some people knock back whiskey. I knock back coffee. I hate the taste. And I've been drinking it for over a decade now. And so, no, mostly it's water, ice water, the occasional soda. I have my morning coffee, but I have that downstairs. I break for lunch. And then by the end of the day, by around 4 or 5 or so, I'm starting to lose my creative oomph. It's funny, your optimum work times when you can afford to freelance and not make yourself work because you're fitting it in around a day job. But when you're freelance, my optimum working time shifted over the years. Now I start earlier and end around 4 or so. And I can hand correct on manuscript after that. But for actual creation, I need to be writing between like 9, 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon.
Wow. Okay. And I have just two more questions for you. One is where can people find your work aside from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester? And
Annie's Bookstop of Worcester.
Yes.
The major chains still carry some of the books. A lot of them are out of print. Once I come up with a new book, we will probably see new copies. Of course, the used booksellers and the online booksellers, you can always go to them. Libraries, of course. Yeah, that's pretty much it right now. I don't have anything current. Tempests Slaughter came out. Well, it's gone through hardcover and paperback editions, so 3-4 years ago. So I'm overdue.
Okay.
I do have, this was something new. I was approached by Sean Speakman. He had done a series of a collection of short stories by fellow writers and asked if I'd be interested in doing a short story. And the premise is it has to be something you've wanted to work on, but have not been able to do. And for years, since the 80s, when I was writing original radio comedy and drama and having it performed in New York and LA, I had based a setting and a basic family on where I grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania and my own relatives. Only in this case, the people in this area, it's Appalachia there and over the western Pennsylvania border, and these people have interbred. They brought over a touch of psychic ability from Scotland when they had leave in the wake of Bonnie Prince Charlie. Wow. And intermarried. And instead of birth defects, as so many problems do when you have a small, tight community happen. Their birth defect is a psychic ability. And each of them has a different one, or they may have one like a relative, but not anyone around them. I started with a pair of sisters for the radio drama that I did, and I've been tinkering with the idea and wanting, actually, I have the second and third Iron book to finish, and I owe Scholastic the Circle of Magic book. And then I would like to take a break from medieval-esque fantasy and go to my hillbillies. And the story I wrote for Sean, that is going to be in one of his collections, is two of the brothers in this one nuclear family. One of them finds things, but far too often he doesn't want to find them. Something bad has happened. He has contact with an object and it leads him. And in fact, at one point, he has a room full of stuff that people have given him the mate to. So if he feels the itch and he knows he might not like it, he goes through that pile and finds the things that are in it. Until, if he can drive the itch away, good. If he can't, he has to go find the thing that wants it. And so him and his younger brother, whose ability works with animals, so much so that his family, he's in his high school years, and they've already sent him to as many animal care classes and groups that they can. And he's known, if your dog gets hit by a car, maybe rather than take him to the vet, take him to Dwayne Fraser and see what Dwayne can do for him. And they find this girl who supposedly fell off a cliff that's a lookout near their house. Turns out she was pushed. And the nice part, and Dwayne's German Shepherd Sarge, whose owner cut out his vocal cords. So Sarge can't bark, but Sarge doesn't need to because he has Dwayne to talk for him. He catches Sarge taking her a hunk of frozen meat because he knows that it's good for her to eat if she's hurt. So that's the story.
Wow.
And the kicker is when he gets there, him and Rayburn both, they discover that the girl who's so badly hurt is the brand new local sheriff's daughter.
Whoa.
And he's come from Chicago and he doesn't know about their extended family yet. And the local people who do know are like, well, how are we going to tell him? Well, let's not tell him yet. He'll find out for himself. No, we got to tell him something.
That's interesting. That sounds like a great story.
I've been working on it since the 80s. I've got, I don't know what the next one's going to be, although I suspect, knowing my fans, are going to want to hear from Rayburn. Though I've got another short story about one of the families, the immediate family decided youngsters wanting something else. They moved to Chicago and they are part of this family, but not so gifted. But the dad got killed in an accident. Mom's remarried. Robbie and her stepdad don't get on. And Robbie, she's only 12 years old. And if she turns her eye on you and tells you to stop, you will stop.
Mm.
You will not do anything else. She's a dominant.
Ooh. Wow.
12 years old. Do you have kids?
No,
Oh, do you have nieces and nephews?
no,
Oh,
unfortunately.
see, you've escaped. Most of the people I know who have kids that age when they find out she can do that at 12, they're like, oh shit. Nobody wants their 12-year-old to be able to tell someone stop.
No, I
They
can
stop.
imagine. Wow. Well, the last question I have for you is how can we follow your work and share your awesomeness?
Well, there's my websites that Julie has up. Just Google Tamora Pierce and it'll pop right up. On Facebook, there are, I think, 3 subsites on Facebook that is for fan stuff. One's all the Circle of Magic universe, one's all Tortal, one's Tamora Pierce fans, and one's Facebook will not let me have more than 500 friends, but they do have another facet where you can have unlimited people show up. And so Tamora Pierce on Facebook or Tamora Pierce Unlimited are the 2 easiest ways to find me.
Okay, great. Well, that's all I have. And thank you
Okay.
so much for joining me today.
Thank
Really
you.
enjoyed it. And if you ever get to the Boston or Worcester area, please
Yeah.
come
Well, I've been
to our
to
store.
Worcester a couple times.
Ah,
Years and years ago, but I've been. And if you're at Bosco next year, I sure plan to be there.
oh, fantastic. Yeah,
If they're
definitely.
holding, well, I did the online one. If they do the RL one, I will be there.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, and I will definitely see you there.
Great.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a
Okay,
good evening.
you too.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.